Hello, ZeroHedge audience. This is George Gammon. I am here with David Beckworth and Bob Murphy, and today we're going to find out if we should end the Fed. This is going to be incredible. This is a debate you guys are not going to want to miss, and it's brought to us by our good friends at ZeroHedge and JM Bullion. So we're going to start today with David Beckworth. David is from the George Mason Mercatus Institute. Am I saying that right, David?
The Mercatus Center.
Mercatus Center, I'm sorry. And
No
everybody
worries.
knows who my good buddy Bob Murphy is. He is from the Mises Institute. He's got his podcast, The Bob Murphy Show. And Bob is going to take the side that we should end the Fed. And David is going to take the other side of that maybe the Fed is a good idea and we should keep it around. So we're going to let David start the debate by doing his opening statement. David, it's all you.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to this debate. And it's really great to be a part of this conversation today, and a real pleasure to engage with Bob Murphy. He is a legend in Austrian economics. I've had the opportunity to debate Bob back in the day, as Bob will recall, back during the blogging wars of the post-Great Recession period. In fact, if you look at his blog, Free Advice, you'll find 49 posts. I counted this getting ready for the show, 49 posts between 2009 and 2016 where Bob engages with me and usually is debating me. So great times, great memories. And when you look at those posts, one thing you'll notice is Bob has a great sense of humor. He's also very fair, but a great sense of humor. And one post in particular I want to highlight. In May 2011, he noted that I was trained under George Selgin. I was influenced by Larry White. I knew my Ludwig von Mises. I had all the prerequisites to be a good Austrian monetary economist.
David,
And
what
yet
happened?
somehow, in Bob's view, I transformed from an angel of Austrian light into a dark force of mainstream macroeconomics. And in the words of Bob, I became the Count Dooku of Austrian economics. So if you know your Star Wars theory or histories, Count Dooku was trained under Yoda, the great master, turned to the dark side. So that's who I was. And I got a great laugh out of that. In fact, I had students I was teaching back then. They all came to me, Dr. Beckworth, you realize you're Count Dooku of Austrian economics? So Bob was always a lot of fun to engage with. Now, I want to bring that up because it raises a bigger point, that post. It's funny, but like Bob, I too come from a freedom promoting tradition. I care deeply about liberty and human flourishing. In fact, I work at the Mercatus Center. It's a classical liberal organization that promotes liberty, albeit from a pragmatic perspective. So the way I approach the question of whether we should abolish the Fed, I view myself as a kindred spirit to Bob, but one who believes that since we have central banks and they're unlikely to go away, our best path forward is to reform it, to work in it or through it, as opposed to pushing for its abolition altogether. Now, to be clear, I'm very sympathetic to all the free market monetary experiences we've seen in the past. I really draw inspiration from the Scottish free banking period of 1716 to 1845, the Canadian free banking period, 1817 to 1935. There was no central bank, no deposit insurance. They had competitive currency issue, and they delivered relative financial stability and economic growth. Now, I know Bob is less enthusiastic about these cases, and he prefers more of a commodity standard with gold or otherwise and narrow banking. I'll let him maybe flesh that out. But my view is this: whatever your view is of the ideal sound money system, use it to inform your view of how to improve the central bank. Use it as a benchmark. And that's where I come from. And let me give you 3 reasons why I think this is the best way forward. First, the horse is out of the barn. Central banking is now the global norm. There's 192 banks around the world that can be loosely defined as independent central banks. These institutions are deeply entrenched. I've been openly critical of them, to be clear, for their roles in the Great Recession, the Eurozone crisis, the pandemic inflation. Yes, their hands are dirty, but over time they're embedded and they've become a part of major economies. So I don't see them going away quickly. Let me give you 2 quick examples. During the Eurozone crisis, as many of you know, Greece was really suffering immensely. Greece, its GDP fell 25%, unemployment hit 28%, and a political party came to power named Syriza, and they campaigned on getting out of the euro, ending austerity. But guess what? They ended up staying in the Eurozone. Why? Because the public feared hyperinflation if Greece left. They feared the country would devalue. So despite the pain and suffering, and polls show this, the public wanted to stay in the Eurozone. They wanted the euro. They wanted the ECB, the central bank, over the pain they were suffering. And that just further entrenched the ECB and is a good example of why I don't think central banks are going to go. Let's go to the Fed. That's really the central bank at hand here. And I want to give just one example about the Fed. The Fed now manages a global dollar system. And yes, the US economy has a part to play that. Yes, our deep capital markets are part of that. But the Fed has played a pivotal role as well as in making this dollar system global. It tolerated and kind of implicitly endorsed the euro dollar market when it first emerged. It facilitated offshore repo, dollar repo. It's used its liquidity tools like the currency swap line, the FEMA repo facility, and it has really entrenched the dollar as the world's kind of monetary backbone. Just as one example, I could go into many more, but one example, the BIS reports that dollar credit to the non-bank parts of the world is at $88 trillion. So loans and debt. And that's more than double the next biggest one, number two. That's the euro and debt instruments and loans in euro. So in short, the US dollar network is a global hegemon, and it's the Fed who manages it. So it just seems unlikely to me we could get rid of that. And if we could get rid of it, if Bob got his way, it would be very disruptive. And I think it would do more harm to those of us who do want to promote a world of more human liberty, of sound money and such. So I think it's better to work within the system. That was my first point. Second point, real briefly here, we need to acknowledge that our free market ideals did not survive the test of time. So the Scottish free banking system, unfortunately, was legislated out of existence in 1845. The Bank of England and Great Britain said, we want to have monopoly over currency issue. Even the US gold standard, which is sometimes held up as this example of a free system, it was largely an accident of history. It wasn't like this well thought out process. If you go back to 1834, the US Mint changes the ratio between gold and silver. It went from silver to gold, excuse me, went from 15 to 1 to 16 to 1. Now, this matters because it overvalued gold and pushed silver out of circulation. And gold became the de facto standard. Now, this shift took place not because of any deep reasoning or theory. It took place because Andrew Jackson did not like Nicholas Biddle in the Second Bank of the United States. He changed their ratio. The Second Bank was using silver. It was literally a personal vendetta that helped usher in the gold standard up until the Civil War. Civil War, we have the suspension of that. It returns in 1879. In the meantime, there's the Coinage Act of 1879, which demonetizes silver. Silver would have likely come back had not been for that. So these are just legislative things, kind of ad hoc choices and political pressures that led to the emergence of the gold standard. And even the best version of the gold standard, the classical gold standard, only lasted 25 years from 1879 to 1914. That is the best version we've seen. It's the one I admire it too, but it wasn't robust to the political economy situation of the world that we live in. And I suspect it'd be the same thing today. And we can come back later and talk about the interwar gold standard, which was also something that did not do very well. Many argue it contributed to the Great Depression because it was so politicized, run by central banks and the like. My third and final point is this. I believe the real issue isn't central banking itself. It's society's underlying commitment to price stability, and more importantly, to fiscal responsibility. If you look at the long run price level of the United States from the beginnings up until World War I, you see that it rose, that it fell, but on average, it was relatively flat. It's almost a straight line. The average is like a straight line you could draw through that series. It's pretty remarkable. Now that stability persisted despite many disruptions. As I mentioned, the suspension of the gold standard from 1861 to 1879, early experiments with central banking, the first bank, second bank in the United States, and large amounts of fiat money was issued during the Civil War. So despite these things, we still had long-run price stability, and it goes back to a deeper institutional commitment to fiscal responsibility, to price stability. We're always going to have wars. No one wants wars, but it's unlikely we've seen the end of wars, pandemics, national emergencies, and inevitably the government will finance some of that with an inflation tax. The issue in my mind, the pragmatic issue, is how do we respond after that? Do we run primary surpluses? Are we fiscally responsible? We make up for what we spent in these crises. And that's something that did happen in the past, has not happened now, and is increasingly not happening. And to me, that's probably the biggest concern we face. So I would argue not only should we reform the Fed, we should be fighting the good fight for fiscal responsibility in the United States. So just to summarize my 3 points for why I'm arguing to mend the Fed, not end it. Central banks are deeply entrenched and not going anywhere, number one. And number two, our historical free market systems, as wonderful as they were, did not stand the test of time, didn't stick around. And three, the real issue in my mind is are we as a society committed to fiscal discipline and long run price stability? And I will stop there.
Okay, Bob, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks to ZeroHedge for hosting this, and thanks to George for moderating, and David, of course, for participating. So we don't have too much time here in these opening remarks. So what I'm going to do is just make the quick case for why it would have been better for the U.S. to have never had the Federal Reserve. And then, I realize a secondary issue is, okay, well, given that it would have been better if it didn't exist, but we have it right now, and maybe it's too painful to unwind. So I'm going to defer that second part of the discussion to the course of this debate. As David acknowledged, that is a big deal. But to make an analogy, if people have seen the movie The Firm, it was based on a novel with Tom Cruise where he's a hotshot lawyer. He ends up working for this firm and then realizes soon into it that, oh my gosh, this is like tied to the mob, and he really wishes he hadn't taken that job offer. And then it's a separate question. Well, geez, how do you extricate yourself once you're in there? But right now, surely, I think the important thing, first of all, is to establish to Americans, it would be better if we didn't have a central bank. So that's what I'm going to try to do in the remaining time I have here. And then again, we can talk more about the details. Well, how do you get rid of it if you concede that it would have been better if it didn't exist? So first of all, let me just read a little bit. So this is from a history of the Fed. And my point here is to say, from the get-go, from its very inception, people knew that this was a dubious enterprise. And let me just give you an example of what I mean. So this history says, by the fall of 1910, Aldrich, referring to Senator Aldrich, who would end up being the primary sponsor of the legislation, was persuaded of the necessity of a central bank for the United States. With Congress ready to begin meeting in just a few weeks, Aldrich, most likely at this guy Davison's suggestion, decided to convene a small group to help him synthesize all he had learned and write down a proposal to establish a central bank. And then it goes on and says who the members were. Some powerful financiers, including a guy tied of German origin. They went to the Jekyll Island Club. Most likely, they got entry through J.P. Morgan, and it was described as the richest, most exclusive, and most inaccessible club in the world. And then here's the key paragraph why I'm reading this for you folks. It says, Aldrich and Davison chose the attendees for their expertise, but Aldrich knew their ties to Wall Street could arouse suspicion about their motives and threaten the bill's political passage. So he went to great lengths to keep the meeting secret, adopting the ruse of a duck hunting trip and instructing the men to come one at a time to a train terminal in New Jersey where they could board his private train car. Once aboard, the men only used their first names, Nelson, Harry, Frank, Paul, Piet, and Arthur, to prevent the staff from learning their identities. For decades after, the group referred to themselves as the First Name Club. Okay, so in this history, by the way, this isn't me drawing from The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, which is famous in this genre. This is from the Federal Reserve's own history, right? This is when they were commemorating their 100th anniversary, they commissioned people to write this essay about its founding. And so that's where that's coming from. So this is all well documented. And that meeting itself actually wasn't even disclosed publicly until the 30s. Okay. And again, as they themselves said, if the public knew the people that were involved with crafting that original legislation, it probably wouldn't have passed. Okay. And so there's that element of it. Let me quickly now just put aside the dubious origin, just say what performance here. And here I'm going to draw, and I would point people to, there's an excellent paper by George Selgin, Larry White, instructors of David, and Lestrapes. They have the paper that was assessing the Fed's performance. And I want to stress here, they were not drawing on data sets from Murray Rothbard or something. This was drawing on conventional mainstream analysis. They got a version of their analysis published in the Journal of Macroeconomics, and they found that in terms of the purchasing power, right? So they were looking at the pre-Fed regime to the post-Fed regime, and clearly it wasn't even close. The dollar maintained its purchasing power, as David acknowledged, for long stretches. Roughly speaking, in the year 1800, what would $100 buy you? That's roughly what $100 would buy you in the year 1900, right? So the dollar maintained its purchasing power. There were ups and downs, but it was roughly stable over long stretches of time. Clearly, looking from 1913 forward, at this point, the dollar's lost more than 99% of its purchasing power. But beyond that, it's not just that there was a general drop in purchasing power, but also the predictability of the price level was also way off. So it's true, the year-to-year volatility of CPI inflation, for example, by some estimates, was lower post-Fed than beforehand. But the thing is, beforehand, if there were periods where prices were rising, you would know statistically going forward, they would probably come back down. because there, again, it was the tie to gold and silver in the beginning and then just gold later on. And so you could, as a business person, you could reasonably guess what is the dollar going to be worth 10, 15, 20 years from now. Whereas once the Fed was up and running, and particularly after 1971, that was no longer the case. So if part of the function of a monetary system is to give long-term stability and predictability, well, the Fed clearly fails on that front. Okay, what about economic volatility? Clearly, one of the main reasons we're supposed to have a central bank, ostensibly, is to smooth out the business cycle. Well, off the top of your head, what was the worst crisis the U.S. ever had economically? Is obviously the Great Depression. When did that happen? The Fed was founded late 1913. Stock market crashes in 29. The Great Depression's all through the 30s, right? So that clearly happened well within the Fed's watch. And then, depending on the data you use, like Romer, for example, has a revision of historical economic performance, and using that data set, even looking at the performance of the Fed after World War II, it's roughly the same as the pre-Fed. So everybody agrees, yeah, if you include the Great Depression, the Fed clearly gave us worse or more volatile economic performance than beforehand. Okay, so on all those criteria, again, objectively, this isn't ideological, the Fed was worse than the pre-Fed era. Okay, so it did not deliver on the very things it was supposed to. It's also a corrupt institution, right? So I, as David alluded to, I personally am a very laissez-faire person. I want the government out of money and banking. I don't want the government picking oil prices, picking the price of real estate, and I don't want them setting interest rates. I don't want the government determining how many houses should be built. I don't want them determining how many units of money should be created. But given that you were going to have the government monopolizing something as important as the stock of money, the next best thing would be have that highly regulated and scrutinized and all sorts of transparency so the public can keep tabs on what this entity is doing. But what we have with the Fed and the central bank is the worst of both worlds. It's a quasi-private organization. It is literally owned by the private banks, right? So the analogy here would be, imagine if the pharmaceutical companies literally own stock in the FDA. That would be crazy. And yet that's what we have with the Federal Reserve right now. And there is no oversight. Just to give an example, in December of 2008, right after the financial crisis, Congress calls Bernanke before them and says, you're doing all these extraordinary lending programs. Can you give us, we're not second guessing you. We're not saying you can't do this, but just tell us who's getting all these billions of short-term loans that you're advancing. And he says, well, I can't do that because that would defeat the purpose of the program. If the public knew who needed the money, there would be a run on that institution. So no, I'm not going to tell you. So Bernanke wouldn't even tell Congress who they were giving this money to. We learned later some of it was being funneled to even foreign banks. So last thing I'll just say on this to wrap up is this is not merely a technical economic discussion, even though I would love to have that with David and we can certainly cover that ground. But among other things, the Fed enables the government to do all sorts of programs that the public wouldn't tolerate. Right off the bat, what was the first thing that the Fed financed was the U.S. entry into World War I. And some defenders of the central bank will say, well, what if there's a war and we need it? Well, yeah, without the Fed, the U.S. couldn't have gotten into World War I. And I would say, yeah, that's a good thing. So for all these reasons, it would be much better for Americans if we got rid of the central bank.
So, David, I think it's important for the audience to define exactly where you and Bob disagree. So I know in your statement, you were talking about just reforming the Fed.
Yeah.
How do you think it would work if we didn't have the Fed? So would you prefer us just not have the Fed if you could wave a magic wand? Or do you think it's better that we have the Fed?
Well, I think conditional on the fact that there is a central bank and it's so entrenched currently, I just can't see how we could get rid of it. But
assume that we could. Would you think
assume that we
would be
could? Yeah,
optimal?
I think I would like my ideal, and again, I know this is not Bob's ideal, but my ideal would be something like the Scottish free banking system, where there was competitive note issue, there was no deposit insurance, there's no central bank, innovation was allowed. And some of what we see today happening with crypto, I think can push us in that direction gently. But that's where I would put as the ideal. If we could start from scratch, there were no institutional barriers, no corruption, all those things. I think that would be my textbook case for a free banking money system. That's kind of the benchmark.
Okay, well, that's not going to be a very good debate. So let's go.
Well, hey, I know Bob. I know Bob well enough. He has criticisms of that system.
I
He
know,
wouldn't
but
actually
let's
land there. So
but that's a little off topic. So
yeah.
David, let's take this path. If you could reform the Fed, how would you do it? And then Bob, maybe you can give us why you don't think that would work, or you think that would be less beneficial than just ending the Fed and ripping the Band-Aid off.
Okay. Well, could I say something real quick to
Sure.
Bob's initial statements? I agree with a lot of what Bob said. How the Fed was set up was very inside. There's a lot of corruption. He mentioned George Salgin. I mentioned George Salgin. I'll throw another George Salgin reference out there. He has a great paper on the formation of the Federal Reserve, and basically it was a bunch of New York bankers and connected people who wanted the Fed system to end up as it did. They didn't want some of the competitive ideas out. There were some people who had proposed a system similar to Canada's, but the New York bankers were concerned it would allow Chicago banks to come into New York and compete, and so there was definitely a lot of under the table, less than pure motives in creating the Fed. Now, with that said, there were also some sincere motives coming out of the 1907 financial crisis. People genuinely wanted something. And that itself was tied to the poor design of the national banking system, comes out of the Civil War. So there's a whole discussion there on the fact that the financial system wasn't well designed. And then on top of that, there's opportunity for shenanigans that Bob alluded to. So I completely agree with that. So reforms that I would like to see that I think would push the Fed in the right direction. I mean, there's many, and that's what I do at my job at Mercatus. I'll throw a few out there, and Bob might see these as marginal, but I think they're meaningful. First, I think the Fed should change how it does monetary policy. It operates with a really large balance sheet. Right now, it's down to just under 7 trillion, leaves a large financial footprint. It doesn't have to be that way. It's using something called a floor system. It could easily, not easily, but it could, I think, go to something more like a ceiling system or something like it had after before 2008. I would prefer going to a ceiling system where the Fed's involvement is passive. It responds to what banks want to do. I could start there. I won't spend much time on that unless you want to ask me questions
Just
about
for
it.
clarification for the audience, you're talking about just leaving the discount rate and taking out reverse repo?
Well, I would leave the facilities in there. The big thing I would push for is this. I would shrink the Fed's balance sheet dramatically. And there's ways to do that are less disruptive than others because Fed's holding a lot of long-term treasuries. Peter Stell has proposed a way where the Treasury would swap T-bills for the Fed's long-term bills or long-term bonds, and it would sell off. The Fed would sell off T-bills. I would shrink it, and then I would push the Fed in a direction where it would rely more on its ceiling. So you think of this, the discount window, make it more used, as well as standing repo facility. And that both those facilities have issues right now. They're not widely used, but there are reforms that could be done. Rely on that, and those would be driven by the demand of the banks, the financial intermediaries, money market funds, and others who might get access to them. You would rely on those as opposed to actively injecting lots of reserves through QE or large scale asset purchases. Now, I want to be clear. In a crisis, I think that's going to happen. And just to speak to something that Bob mentioned, and this is where maybe I might push back a little bit about what Bob said, is yes, the Fed did enable the funding for World War II, for example, World War I. But I think that would have happened whether there was a Fed or not a Fed. They would have come up with some mechanism to fund these emergencies. And so I don't think you can get away from that fact. But okay, so number one, you just reform the Fed's operating system, much smaller balance sheet, make it more passive, driven by the market itself as opposed to the Fed driving it. Change the structure of the Fed, the way it's set up right now. It's got this system where California has one Federal Reserve Bank for almost a third of the country. Population has changed dramatically. We could also talk about maybe, I'm not sure I'm landed here yet, but some have suggested taking some of the bank regulation responsibilities out of the Fed. So, the Fed funds itself out of seigniorage, which allows it to avoid going to Congress asking for money. And you could argue, well, that's okay because it needs to be independent to make the tough calls. But if you're a bank regulator, that's not quite so clear. I mean, the FDIC has to go before Congress and has to get appropriations. Why shouldn't the Fed? Fed's one of the most important bank regulators. Now, it would be tricky because the Fed has the discount window, but that's another way one could think about reforming the Fed. Maybe taking some of the many things that it does off of its plate and focusing just on monetary policy. Better, bank regulations coming out of the Fed. I would argue, as Bob knows, for something like a nominal GDP target. Here's another reform. If you go to a free banking system, what falls out of that is something like a nominal GDP targeting. Again, I want to move the Fed in direction, minimal footprint, and it mimics or at least approximates something like a free banking system. A nominal GDP target would do that. And finally, I'll leave it on this. There's more I could say. I really like where we're going now in terms of allowing fintech, allowing the private sector to innovate with crypto, stable coins, even Bitcoin. And look, I've been a Bitcoin skeptic. I'm warming up to it now as time has gone up. I think as Bitcoin becomes more mature, as we begin to get all the untapped demand for that, and we begin to create layers on top of Bitcoin that can facilitate demand pressures given the fixed supply of Bitcoin, I think there could be a lot happening there. In fact, we may end up in a world closer to Bob's ideal, with narrow banking. So I think the Fed allowing innovation, not to be fearful, not to be politicized. The other thing, the Fed was highly politicized in some of its objectives past few years, and we're coming out of that. So I think this is refreshing. So I'll stop there for
David. What about during just before we pass it back over to Bob? What about a time of crisis? So let's say during COVID, when there's no liquidity in the corporate debt market, would you argue, kind of like Walter Bagehot, that the Fed should be the lender of last resort? And what did he say? Lend on good collateral at a high price, something like that.
Yes.
Do you think that is a good use of the Fed's balance sheet?
Again, given that we have a central bank, yes. I would advocate, though, for some added federal facilities to play a more active role. One of the issues with the Fed becoming so active during these crises is that it's effectively doing fiscal policy. It's making credit allocation decisions, which no one else is doing it. So I understand they have to step in and fill the hole. I think, and many have proposed this, you need some kind of federal facility, something that's approved by Congress, that is more accountability, where during a crisis it would step in and do some of the things that the Fed is doing. Because I think there are big issues. Bob mentioned Bernanke wouldn't answer the question, right? And there have been some reforms. Dodd-Frank that now makes it much tougher. Like, for example, the Fed cannot lend to one institution anymore. It has to be widely a number of institutions. But I think getting more of emergency lending through some other facility that's more accountable, directed at Congress. Kate Judge, Rich Clarida have a proposal for this along these lines. So I think the Fed still has a role to play in that space, but there's room for innovation in other federal agencies. Again, given we have the state, given that they are going to intervene, what's the best way forward, most efficient path?
Okay, so Bob, in summary here, we're just kind of tweaking the way Fed does monetary policy, really putting a ceiling on interest rates and letting the chips fall where they may, taking out that floor of reverse repo. And then we're talking about nominal GDP targeting. We're talking about reducing the size of the Fed's balance sheet, and then shifting the burden of being the lender of last resort, or the bailouts, to the federal government as opposed to the Federal Reserve. What is wrong with this path forward? What's wrong with that type of solution?
Okay, sure. And I'll try to, in this segment, very quickly also address the three big points that David made. I'll try to keep it fast here and keep it snappy. Largely, we could quibble on some of the details, but I don't have a problem, given that there's going to be the Fed and it's going to do the kind of things it does, and we're just allowed to change, some of its procedures. I don't have a huge problem with the things that David said. I would certainly rather David be the chair of the Fed than somebody else, right? But you know what? They're not going to make him the chair of it, not because he's not smart enough, because he's too honest, right? And I'm not saying that just to be playing to the crowd or something, but it was hilarious to me that back during the financial crisis, the Fed began paying interest on reserves. I think it was October of 2008. And this is right when, we need liquidity. We're yeah, we got to do the TARP program. That's fiscal. That's not, the Fed wasn't doing that direct, but yeah, we got to bail out Wall Street. It really hurts us to do this. We hate helping, politically connected billionaires, but we got to bail out Wall Street in order to keep credit flowing to Main Street. And right when they were saying all that stuff and buying the so-called toxic assets is when the Fed started paying banks to not make loans to their customers, right? They called it interest on reserves, but that's one way of describing what it was they started doing right then. And there were a bunch of academic economists like Scott Summer, people like scratching their heads like, huh, that's kind of weird. I mean, that doesn't even line up with what Bernanke said when he wrote about the Great Depression. And it was like, well, yeah, maybe because this is funneling a bunch of money to the people who own the Fed. And I don't think Bernanke would have been in that position if they didn't know this guy's going to play ball when push comes to shove. Whereas I don't think David would, and that's why he's not going to be the Fed chair ever. All right. So there's that element. As far as his 3 points, or let me just hit the lender of last resort. So yes, you read a conventional history of the origin of the Fed. There was the panic in 1907. A financial crisis hit. A bunch of institutions, firms that were solvent but illiquid, right? In other words, their assets were higher than the liabilities. They were a good ongoing enterprise. They should stay in business. It was a good business. It was just they had cash flow issues and credit dried up, and they had to go hat in hand to guys like J.P. Morgan or whatever. And people just thought, this is kind of crazy that these few wealthy individuals who happen to be liquid are just picking winners and losers and had this much power in our system. Let's have it more under public control. Okay, so that was that's the rationale. But then what happens in practice is it's not that it's democratized and now the people determine. No, it's still getting favoritism, and Lehman goes down, others get saved, and that's sort of well known. But put all that aside, just technically look at it again, as you said, George. Walter Bagehot's dictum was lend freely at a high rate of discount, right? And so the idea being, if there is a cash crunch, yeah, you want the central bank to come in as a lender of last resort, provide liquidity, but charging a penalty rate. Even I think that was even the term they sometimes used, because
On
they
good
want to
collateral.
make sure,
On good collateral.
yeah, only firms that really ought to stay in business, right? That they're just going to use the loan for like 3 months until the crisis ebbs, then they're going to pay off the loan, right? That's the opposite of what the Fed came in, had interest rates were 0% for 7 years, right after the financial crisis. That's the exact opposite, and they were literally buying things that had been called toxic assets, right? So anyway, I'm just saying that's, call that what you will, but that's not exercising the wise, prudent operation of a lender of last resort that only allows the people that kind of got caught in a crunch. No, it's just keeping afloat a lot of firms that should have gone down, right? And so that cleansing process didn't happen. It was short-circuited by having the Fed around. So real quickly here, and I'll turn it back to you guys in terms of David's 3 things. So he said, the horse is out of the barn. Okay, fair enough, but by the same token, I would say that so he's saying in a sense like we can't unwind this thing. We can talk later about I do have ideas of how could you get rid of this. The only thing I'll just say on that is people should not conflate the Federal Reserve with the existence of U.S. dollars, right? Americans were using U.S. dollars in 1912. Okay, so that it's not that if we got rid of the Fed, that means, oh, geez, there goes the dollar. So I'll just say that. To say the free market failed, I mean, yeah, you could say that, but I can say that about any proposal right now. In other words, if the right thing to do is to have more free market capitalism and something, you could always say, well, the reason we don't have that is because the public wanted or politicians pushed through intervention, and that's always going to be true. But to me, that doesn't mean, okay, just stop saying what the truth is. And right now we're arguing over reform, so at least I want to say what the truth is. And then the last thing, as far as David's last point about price stability and fiscal discipline, I think if what you want is price stability and fiscal discipline, the last thing in the world you want is to keep the Federal Reserve around, because that is monetizing trillions of dollars worth of the government's deficits. Like during the Obama years, they had 4 years in a row of $1 trillion plus deficits right when QE was coincidentally happening. I don't think that was a coincidence. I don't think that was the independent Fed. I think they were monetizing the debt there. And then same thing, that kind of goes hand in, and then the price stability too. Again, if you want price stability, the record's pretty clear. You did have long-term century plus price stability before the Fed. Dollars lost 99 point whatever 5% of its value since the Fed. So if you want price stability, why would you want the Fed?
And Bob, what do you think about having a facility in the government to go ahead, and it's run by Congress, to enact these bailouts if the businesses of the banks are in trouble at no fault of their own? Again, a good example is 2020.
So again, if where my ideal is, and I'm totally on board with David's idea about fintech, and that's what I do in my day job, working in Infineon. We're putting stuff on the blockchain. I love stable coins in terms of trying to get away from banks. So I think with a lot of this, it's like if we were arguing about getting rid of the post office and then FedEx and UPS come along and kind of make it a moot point, right? So I think it's
Yeah,
that's kind of what we're doing.
but during 2020, there's no liquidity. Like no private entity was going to provide the liquidity, and you could argue that the trade-offs there would have been a net positive for the government actually stepping in that case, because if there's no liquidity, if the whole system crashes, then we go to Mad Max.
You can argue that, again, it's going to be hard to do a counterfactual. I think part of what happens there is the system gets dependent on and thinks there is this giant entity that has already been creating trillions of dollars since 2008. And so, they can come in and create boatloads. I think if we had been in an alternate timeline, then, that they would have looked to other sources. And also, again, private banks and whatever, they're allowed to issue dollars. It's just they wouldn't be base money. So I realize I'm trying to cram in a lot here. Maybe as this goes back and forth, I can flesh that out a little bit in terms of, well, what would it look like? How would there be dollars? But yeah, my idea is that the federal government would just be creating like U.S. notes. That's the base money. And then private banks, just like, as you know, well, George, the euro dollar market, that's mostly private banks issuing claims on dollars.
All right,
so
dollar
all
credit
that could still happen. And I think, you'd say, well, there wouldn't have been as much liquidity. Right. And there shouldn't have been. But I think in a crisis, you don't want everyone just to get spigots of money. That all that does is allow them to get through it, and you keep the same flawed system in place, and the crisis just getting bigger and bigger until the currency eventually collapses. And this way, maybe it's like with if you always put out the forest fires, and then when the big one hits, like it's a catastrophe. I think that's like an analogy for what happens here. You keep putting out the little crises by just printing money, and maybe that gets you through it. But eventually, when you can't stop it, then it's a disaster.
Okay, David, what would you say about Bob's point where the price stability was a lot worse under the Fed, and the Fed actually facilitates the government's ability to borrow and spend?
Well, on the first point, I cannot argue with Bob. I mean, he shared a great paper. Maybe we can make it available to people who are watching this. But the George Selgin, Larry White, I think Bill Lestrap's paper documents this fairly well, for sure. I mean, in fact, you don't need that paper. Go to, I believe it's eh.net. How much is it worth? They have a data set that goes back to the late 1700s. You can plug in the price level. You can see if you pull back far enough, it's a straight line, then it takes off. So there's no question about that. But on the second point, I would push back on Bob a little bit. I don't think it's the central bank itself that is causing the instability, the inflation. I think it's the deeper commitment to price stability institutions. If you go back to the period where we do have this long run overall price stability, we had periods, for example, where the Treasury, 1840s, was doing open market operations. So even if there is no central bank, you may still have that same role, that same function step in when times are needed. We had two central banks. We had fiat money issued during the Civil War, a lot of it. But the thing is, we then pulled it back between end of the Civil War, 1865 and 1879. There was some deflation. We made sure to get back to some path that we thought was optimal. And so I don't want to give the central bank, the Fed, too much credit here. I think, yes, the Fed does make it easy, does enable it. And there are plenty of experience times where the Fed effectively was subservient to Treasury. And this is a concern on a practical level. This is a concern I think we have now going forward. We see President Trump calling for Jerome Powell to do what? Cut rates, because there's this big interest payment on the debt. And that's very different than his calls in 2018, 2019, when he was saying, hey, Powell, cut rates because I want the economy to do well. I'm going to go re-election. So I do worry about that. But again, I don't think this would be any different if if it was all consolidated into the Treasury. It would still be a temptation. And I think that's the issue. It's not the central bank itself. It's the deeper commitment to price stability. Also, just to talk about the global dollar system a little bit more, I do think if you ended the Fed suddenly, now again, Bob's not suggesting a sudden disruption like that, but the global dollar market has grown dramatically in part because of the Fed. It's not, yes, there were dollars before, but the system that we have was enabled, and maybe you could argue that's an improper role for the Fed. But again, the Fed looked the other way when euro dollar markets were emerging. Regulation Q was on banks in the US, which prevented them from paying much interest, where these banks overseas could pay more. And the Fed could have stepped in and said, no, we won't do that. The New York Fed clears a lot of international payments. It could have stepped in. It did not. These currency swap lines, immensely important. I would argue if the Fed had not used the currency swap lines in 2008, in 2020, you spoke about the liquidity shortage. It wasn't just the US, it was overseas. There's lots of dollar liabilities overseas, banks and other firms. They can't run to the ECB and ask for help if there's a sudden big crisis. Now, again, you could argue maybe this is setting up moral hazard. This is creating a problem. That's fine. But I also think we should be charitable to, I hate to say the Fed, but to the government. There are going to be these national global crisis. I mean, you mentioned there was no liquidity in 2020. It was a once in a lifetime pandemic. We had a pandemic, of course, about 100 years before that. But my point is, when you have really big national emergencies, global emergencies, the normal rules of the game don't apply. You have to do things you wouldn't normally do. I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is after it's over, not imposing discipline, not raising taxes, cutting spending, running primary surpluses. The real issue in my mind, again, is that we're running these primary deficits and it's peacetime. There's no emergency. We're at full employment. There's really no good excuse other than the lack of political will to make meaningful change.
Okay, so Bob, let's go back to what David was saying about maybe what you're talking about, the data points of the Fed, and that the dollar lost 99%. Maybe that is just correlation and it isn't necessarily causation, because we had all this fiat currency creation during the Civil War. That was baked into the 1800s. We had a lot of what we've seen in, let's say, the 1900s when we had the Fed, back during the 1800s when we didn't, but yet we had dollar, quote unquote, stability back then. And we had a massive loss of dollar purchasing power, as we all know, since 1913. So maybe the Fed was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. And just to double down on what David was saying, I'll kind of take his position here for a moment. And Bob, you know this, we've talked about it many times. But what's interesting is M2 money supply from 1880, I believe, to 1900 increased just about the same amount as it did between 2000 and 2020, when we had massive amounts of QE. So maybe you can't blame the Fed for everything that we saw during the 1900s.
Oh, I mean, I certainly agree with that statement. And also, history is very complicated. What would be an interesting question is if you said to me, gun to my head, you can either get rid of the central, just say the U.S. can't have a central bank, or it has a central bank, but there's on the classical gold standard. I probably would pick the classical gold standard, right? And just say that to me, that would tie the hands in the Fed. The Fed can't hurt you too much if the dollar ultimately has to be redeemable for gold, and that's the ultimate constraint on how many dollars they can create, even in terms of base money. So I would say that. So that's partly what goes on and makes the story difficult. Like, even to say, oh, since 1913, the Fed lost, or the dollar lost blah, 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 of its purchasing power. Well, a lot of it's since 1971, right? So it's still true from 1913 to 71, the dollar lost more purchasing power than if you look backwards the same length of time from 1913 backwards. So even on the weakened gold standard, but you get my point. So I certainly agree with that. But again, having said, let me put it to you this way: if it almost sounds like we're saying, oh, come on, the Fed really has nothing to do much with it. If I said, okay, so let's just get rid of the Fed tomorrow and we can still inflate and everything, we can do all this stuff, everybody would freak out and say, no, wait, what are you doing? That would be crazy, right? So there must be some reason that it's important to have the central bank. One thing I used to do with my students is I would show a graph of the Fed's balance sheet, like its assets. And I would say, hey, if you're ever taking a history test and you need to know when all the major U.S. wars happened and you lost your crib notes, just have this graph of the Fed's balance sheet, because whenever it goes up, that's when there's a big war, right? Because the Fed comes in and monetizes, the government borrows a bunch of money to pay for the war. They can't just raise taxes that much. The public wouldn't go for it. They can't even just explicitly borrow that much. The Fed has to basically print the money, electronically in more modern times. So again, that's not to say if you got rid of the central bank, there would be no war anymore, but certainly it enables it. Just like, hey, if you had a nuclear non-proliferation treaties and got rid of nukes, there would still be wars. It's just they wouldn't possibly be as dangerous, right? So it's that kind of analogy with all this stuff. So yes, bad things happened during the Civil War. They printed greenbacks, but again, the public back then was committed. And also too, there were these stretches where there were reasons that the first Bank of the United States and second Bank of the United States failed. We're allowed to die. And again, through all that stretch, the U.S. managed to survive. The U.S. had a great economic expansion during periods when there was no central bank. And even those things, people would say, the first and second Bank of the United States were not central banks the way the Bank of England or the Bank of France were. Like the U.S. didn't even have a real central bank until the Fed. And the last thing I'll say, even there, the reason they called it the Federal Reserve instead of just the U.S. Bank or the Bank of America is because they wanted it was distributed among the 12 district banks originally, especially in the original legislation. They consolidated in 1935, but originally it wasn't like what's the Fed's discount rate. Each bank set its own policy and had its own open market operations because again, they knew Americans are very distrustful of centralized authority. We don't want to be like Europe. We want, we're free Americans.
Yeah. So David, maybe, do you think that if we were to get this reform, that someone makes you king for a day, you reform the Fed, 6 months later or 3 years later, don't we just end up in the exact same spot? Because if we still have the Fed there, if it can still facilitate these things, the public will always, or the government will always revert back to, well, the Fed can just go ahead and create bank reserves or quote unquote create print money, or they can set up these facilities. And even though you get that reform that you want, when the next Fed chair comes in, they just go right back to this because that's human nature. That's how we got here to begin with.
Yeah, no doubt. And this is where I think it's useful to look at an accounting identity, the consolidated government budget constraint. At the end of the day, the Fed is not truly independent. There is some semblance of independence, but they're mostly norms. We come to expect the well-behaved central banker not to be influenced by the president, but that's just norms. From an economic perspective, at the end of the day, push comes to shove, the central bank will keep the government solvent if it's needed. That's fiscal dominance. So you're right. I could push for nominal GDP targeting. I could push for a smaller Fed balance sheet, but I put those policies through. I do better bank regulation. Maybe even I take bank regulation out of the Fed. I do all these things that I might like to do. At the end of the day, the central bank is going to bow on its knee to what the Treasury and Congress wants. So it's not going to change. And let me go back to the interwar gold standard. I just briefly alluded to it in my opening statement, but I think it's a useful illustration of the challenge we now face. And again, I think it underscores my bigger point about the real issue is fiscal responsibility. And whether we have a central bank or not is a symptom of that. Now, to be clear, let me respond to Bob. You're absolutely right, Bob, that having a central bank makes it easier. It enables it. Sure, it does that. But I think even without a central bank, we would find a way to monetize the debt, to print money when we needed to do that. But the interwar gold standard is a really fascinating period because the classical gold standard from 1879 to 1914, it worked relatively well. The Economist magazine wrote about globalization, the first wave of right before World War I, and part of the story was the gold standard facilitating international trade. You come to the interwar gold standard, it starts around 1925 when Great Britain readopts it, but Great Britain, it re-enters at an overvalued exchange rate. It's very destabilizing. It's not even a true gold standard. It was called the gold exchange standard because your currency was tied to another currency, which was then tied to gold. But the idea was gold was still the anchor. But the problem was for a central bank system to work with this, they would have to behave themselves. They would have to allow gold to flow across borders. Your listeners probably know this, but with the gold standard, it's naturally equilibrates price levels across countries who are on the gold standard, but it requires gold flowing in and out of countries for that to happen. And what we saw was France was the biggest villain, if I can say that here, the biggest culprit in this. France sterilized a lot of gold outflows. It kept the gold, and it fueled this deflation in the rest of the world. The U.S. was a second player, not as big as France. Doug Irwin has a great paper that it's titled Did France cause a Great Depression? Question mark. I was recently at a conference, and there were some people from the French National Bank, and I shared this with them. They didn't like it as much as I did. I thought it was funny. I was trying my Bob Murphy type of humor on them. It didn't land as well as Bob probably would have done it. But the point is this: central bankers cheated. They didn't play by the rules of the game. I don't think a gold standard today would be any different. The issue is, and Barry Eichengreen has a book called Golden Fetters. It's really great. He argues the enfranchisement of voters just simply remove the possibility of a gold standard working as well as it ever did in the classic gold standard. Voters are not going to allow the painful adjustments that may be needed at times for the gold standard to flow across borders. And that's why the interwar gold standard, in my mind, the fundamental reason, there's a bunch of other things, but I think fundamentally that's the issue. And I think that's still the issue today, whatever it may be. So you're right, George, whether it's nominal GDP targeting or not, fiscal demands will, dominate and take over any kind of ideal central bank world. And I do think, you visit central bankers, I think they're good people. They mean well, but the reality is they do face these constraints. And again, to me, probably the most pressing issue is our lack of fiscal solvency going forward.
Can I say something just real fast on that, George?
Yeah.
So I stipulate most of the, well, I don't agree with the central bankers are mostly good people part, but other than that, this is a good example, right? So Murray Rothbard in his book on America's Great Depression, I'm going to summarize it down and give like the layperson version, but during World War I, all the major belligerents went off gold because in the beginning of the war, a lot of analysts thought this war is going to be over in a few months because they said the powers can't afford it, right? This is too expensive. But they all went off gold. And so all of a sudden they could, right? They could afford to keep slaughtering each other because it's expensive to kill that many people, right? The U.S. Largely stayed, the dollar tied to gold. They like forbid the exportation of gold, bullion, stuff like that. But okay. And so Great Britain, they printed up a bunch of pounds. And so, but they wanted to go back to the pre-war parity. And so what was happening is if they just let things the way they were in the mid-20s, then the dollar would have strengthened against the pound, and they didn't want that. And so people from the Bank of England talked to people at the Fed in the mid-20s and said, you got to help us out. You need to inflate because we're trying to go back on gold, and that's just going to be too painful. We already have all this painful deflation, and workers are upset and everything because their wages are, it's just too painful. So you can help us out, take pressure off us if you print more dollars. And Rothbard argues that's partly what fueled the stock market bubble in the U.S. in the 20s that then famously crashed in 29. Right, so all this stuff, it's not just all of a sudden a tornado hit. Oh, then for no reason the stock market crashed in 1929. No, there's reasons, and the Fed had, according to Rothbard, a lot to do with that. So again, just all these different things. Yes, I think if Hayek had been at the helm or David Beckworth's great grandfather, it might have been steered better. But the point is, again, we in the Soviet Union, I'm sure when certain farms failed and this happened, factories didn't perform well, you could come in and say, well, they could have done X, Y, and Z. But the real answer, you can't have a centrally run system, and to have this central bank that is dictating policy like that, there's no right way to do that. It's going to keep screwing up, and then on top of that, the most politically connected, corrupt people are going to have access to it. It's not just that they're going to make honest mistakes randomly.
Yeah. So, David, I mean, the point there is the Fed is going to create these economic distortions because if it is managing monetary policy, even if it's just through the discount window, then it's never going to be right all the time. In fact, history teaches us that it's going to be wrong more often than it's right. So even with that tweak, don't we still get a lot of the economic distortions that damage the U.S. economy and create a lower standard of living?
We will still have distortions. I've had some of Bob's friends reach out to me on Twitter. David, what about Cantillon effects? What about that? Those will always be there. There's no doubt. So my objective would be then just to minimize it, do as best you can. And I think something like nominal GDP targeting would be something along those lines. I mean, if I'll throw a proposal out there, my colleague, he's now retired, Scott Sumner, he proposed a nominal GDP's futures contract where you would get the market involved. But nominal GDP targeting, again, I don't want to go too far down this path, but it is effectively a way to stabilize spending, to minimize these type of distortions. And going back to the Fed's operating system, you can also do more there. The when I said the ceiling system, I don't literally mean cap rates at the ceiling, but the ceiling, it would be adjusted, but it would be demand driven, and you would allow more counterparty access. There's a lot of issues when you allow more counterparties to access Fed facilities. Take the standing repo facility, for example. It only right now allows depository institutions, banks, and primary dealers. I think for it to be effective, it needs to allow more. But you allow more, there's moral hazard problems that are created. There's been proposals to allow the standing repo facility to use a central clearing facility, so it's not a direct counterparty, but it would minimize these Cantillon effects. So I do think there are ways to minimize it, both the operating side and the target. But yeah, you'll never get rid of it altogether. But then again, I don't think you'll ever get rid of central banks either.
But if we can't get rid of the central bank, why don't we get them out of the game of micromanaging interest rates altogether, and then the balance sheet as well, and then just go back to Walter Badgett? So if we have to expand the balance sheet, it's just based on lending on good collateral at very high prices, and just eliminate the whole micromanagement of interest rates altogether.
So in that case, you would have to go to a system where you would have to do something. Here's the thing: if you're a central bank and demand for money is growing over time, and you control base money, you're going to have to either respond to it or not. You can do it either by adjusting rates, and let's say you don't want to go down that path. Then the alternative is you're going to have to adjust the base. So maybe George, you could go down the path of something like targeting the growth rate of the monetary base or some monetary aggregate. And that's something you could do. That was proposed before. I don't think it's ever truly been tried, even though Milton Friedman advocated for it. But I don't think if you have a central bank, you can fully escape the tension that's going to arise as the economy grows, population grows, demand for money grows, as innovation in financial technology emerges, velocity money demand is going to change. The central bank is whether it does nothing or does something is going to have a bearing on money conditions, interest rates, liquidity. So I'm not sure you can escape and just kind of step back. It's either going to have a hand in the quantity of money or in the price of money or the price of credit.
Okay, guys, we're going to take a timeout really quick because we need to go to a word from our sponsor. So I think the guys at ZeroHedge are going to cut right here, go to a quick commercial on JM Bullion, the sponsor for one of the sponsors for this video, and then we'll be right back with more of this great debate.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals, they're our standard. Our commitment to customer discretion and privacy with secure and confidential transactions has earned us an unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals, backed by over 375,000 reviews, averaging 4.8 out of 5 stars. Only at JM Bullion.
Guys, so we are back with this incredible ZeroHedge debate with David Beckworth and Bob Murphy. Bob, why don't you go ahead and respond to what David was saying there about interest rates? I mean, if the Fed isn't managing base money, then how on earth do we get this liquidity that we need for the economy to grow?
Okay, sure. And so let me just, I think, maybe speak a bit to like what does it mean? What do I talk about getting rid of this thing? So just very quickly, again, there's an important distinction between official U.S. currency that's legal, legal tender for the satisfaction of debts denominated in U.S. dollars versus claims on private banks. Okay, so there's a legitimate sense when a private bank issues a mortgage, there's a sense in which it's, quote, creating money, right? Like M1 and M2 expand by the very act of them giving someone a mortgage. That's true. However, when the Federal Reserve buys $1 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities, the $1 billion that it creates there is legally more significant or higher on the chain of scale than what Citibank or Bank of America can do. Okay, and so what I'm suggesting is take that power away from the current Federal Reserve banks and put that back in the hands of the Treasury. Again, not because I like that, but because I'm just trying to isolate, for the purposes of this debate, it wasn't should we get rid of government money and just have private sector issued money. And I would have taken the affirmative in that. I would have made a different presentation. But here, since we're just talking about could you get rid of the Fed, I'm just trying to isolate and show people that the U.S. dollar is distinct from that. Okay, and so all the stuff that David had said earlier about, well, geez, there's all these swap lines and stuff with it, all going through primarily like the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. I agree, and yeah, it would be very disruptive to snap your fingers and have that disappear next Tuesday. And so I'm not advocating, but what I would say is clearly you take away the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's ability that when they buy assets, the type of reserves they're creating and crediting to their clients, or there's a seller, that is qualitatively legally superior, and that's just as good as $100 Federal Reserve notes, right? So that's what I'm suggesting on that front. An analogy would be, in the old Soviet Union when it fell apart, there's all sorts of state-owned enterprises, and it would have been silly just to go and take a sledgehammer or dynamite all those factories and things. What did they do? They privatized them, and there were better and worse ways of doing it. Don't get me wrong, but the point is, if there was a legitimate operation that the Soviet government controlled and owned, that you would want to get that in private sector hands. So likewise, yes, if there's a lot of clearinghouse operations and things like that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is doing right now for the global financial system, you can still have them do it. All I'm saying is take away their special privileges. For the near term, put that back in the hands of the Treasury. And then if you say, well, what rules should they use? I would say go back to a hard gold standard where you just lock in the current market price of gold. And then if you want the Treasury to issue more actual U.S. notes, they couldn't call them Federal Reserve notes because it wouldn't be the Fed anymore, then, like a $100 bill that looks green and has pictures of Ben Franklin on it, then you have to bring a certain amount of gold and give it to them, and then they give you the right number of bills. Like that's the system I'm imagining in terms of controlling the base. And then interest rates are whatever they are, right? Just like you don't have 12 people on a committee that pick what's crude oil price is going to be, what's our target for that. You don't need that in a market economy.
Okay, so David, doesn't that do the exact same thing that you were arguing against when I was talking about getting rid of the Fed? You said, well, who's going to create this base money in order for the economy to grow? But what Bob's saying is we're going to limit the amount of base money based on this gold standard. So how would you see that playing out?
Well, my concern would be that, well, assuming we can get past the transition, because there'd be some, I think, rough bumps in the road to that. Let's go to a steady state, use an economics term. We're in this system Bob has set up. I still think there would be the challenge that there would be swings in demand for base money. And that is the challenge of a gold standard or any commodity standard. How do you handle swings in demand for base? If there's a panic, if there's something that happens now over steady periods, not a big deal. In fact, Bob's proposal might even allow for some benign deflation to emerge, which I'm very sympathetic to. I think Spellum periods show that benign deflation is consistent with robust economic growth. But I would worry about something like the Great Depression. Again, that's an extreme event. And Bob could point to the Fed. I would point to the gold standard, the interworld gold standard. And so here's the issue. Maybe I could step back. Whether it's gold, commodity, crypto, Bitcoin, the issue is this: when you're talking about money, there's the demand for money and the supply of money, whether it's inside money, outside money, monetary base, M1, M2. And what Bob is proposing, if I understand correctly, is basically to freeze, or at least to keep it equal to the supply of gold, which could also grow over time. And there's a beautiful natural equilibrating process to that growth in gold given demand over long periods. But in short-term horizons, there can be big swings in demand. And that's where I would be concerned. How would it handle that? Here's the situation. Would the Treasury be able to say, we're not going to respond to the increased demand for base money, even though there's events happening overseas that's driving this? We're going to be strong. We're going to stick with it. So I just not sure how they would be able to accommodate that in this world. And even if they could politically, I'm not sure I would want it, because it could be very destabilizing.
Bob, how do you respond to that? Because I've heard that a lot, basically talking about money elasticity. Sure. If the base money doesn't have any elasticity, then that can impact M2, and that can put you in a very precarious position, especially something like going back to 2020.
Okay, sure. So one thing is just when he alluded to and said, like look what happened in the Great Depression. and he anticipated what my response is going to be and say, it's wild, right? That this happens a lot where people will point to an episode that both leftists and people on the right say the Fed caused this problem and say, and that's why we need the Fed, because otherwise this problem that happened on the Fed's watch and that it directly caused, according to a lot of people, might happen again, right? So there's that element, but also, and David was trying to be more nuanced, say, I know people blame it on the Fed, but it's more the gold standard. But David himself admitted this was not, their grandpa's gold standard. This was, a beaten down, adulterated interwar. So I agree. If you weaken the gold standard, it doesn't work as well as a strong gold standard, right? But to me, that's not a critique of the gold standard. That's just saying that's why. In other words, the mistake in the early 30s to me is not to look at that and say, oh, you see, that's why. If you're going to have a weakened gold standard, you also need to have a central bank, and don't have the central bank do the exact wrong thing like they did back then, right? Or you could just have a better gold standard, right? So I'm just saying we all agree that what they did didn't work, and I'm just proposing a different and to be a simpler solution, right? And it's not just a matter of he wants the dial to go one way and I want to go a different way. I'm saying I'm taking away the ability for all these people to do the wrong thing and rely on market forces. But other just main response to that issue is I would say that I think in the kind of system I'm proposing, where there is what you could call free banking, the government is, and this is just my concession out of pragmatism to limit the scope of this discussion, that assume the Treasury is still issuing, $100, $50 bills with pictures of dead Americans on them, and that's the base money. If all of a sudden people want to hold more, quote, cash, then the private banks that issue claims on that can go ahead and expand that, right? So, I mean, what would happen in practice is the reserve ratio would go down, right? Or we talked earlier about stable coins, right? As long as the authorities allowed you to issue it right now, like the recent Genius Act is putting much higher limits on reserve requirements on stablecoin issuers than they put on banks. But, if stablecoin issuers were allowed to issue claims on US dollars and didn't need to show 100% reserves with, T-bills or better, then they could expand it too. So again, I think that accordion-like system would be a lot more robust in the kind of framework I'm talking about. Whereas now, there's crises and stuff, but that's because I think there's all sorts of hidden subsidies and bailouts and stuff like that where, they make money on the way up and then the taxpayer covers them on the way down.
Yeah. So, David, I think an example of what Bob is saying is if you look at the Fed's balance sheet or bank reserves, more specifically, from 1980 to 2007, it was flat. It really didn't move. But you had M2 money supply in the United States go from 1.5 trillion to 7.5 trillion. And then you had the euro dollar market creating a heck of a lot more dollars outside of the United States than just the $6 trillion that increased in United States M2. So do we really need more base money if the banks are able to basically settle on their own balance sheet?
Absolutely, George. I mean, that's one reason I want to go back to a smaller balance sheet. I think a lot can be done with a much smaller footprint from the Fed and such. But I want to go back to what Bob, I'm actually quite surprised, and I'm delighted to hear you. What sound like to me, you conceding that a free banking system of sorts, which would mean, if you freeze whatever your base is, commodity, maybe it's Bitcoin, whatever it may be. But you would allow the banks to accommodate the increased demand for money. If I heard you correctly, that sounds
basically
very
fractional reserve instead of full reserve.
Yeah, fractional reserve. I'll throw it out there, fractional reserve. And I guess I'm a little surprised because my understanding would be that that would be a no-no for Bob, but maybe I misunderstood.
Okay, yeah. So let me just clarify on that. It's and I see, David, you're so excited. You're willing to just concede this debate if you can win the other one, right?
Yeah. Free banking, let's go home.
Right. So, I mean, that is the logical implication of what I just said. So my position on the fractional reserve banking stuff is I don't want the federal authorities doing anything with banks, right? And so it's not that I have ever advocated that the Federal Reserve or, the U.S. Treasury or anybody, any kind of federal regulator comes in and says, if we catch you with less than 100% reserves on your checking accounts, then you're going to get a big fine. I have never advocated. What I have said is if they got rid of FDIC, if the Fed went away or at least stopped acting as a lender of last resort and all that sort of thing, if you took away all the privileges, if you didn't allow banks just to say, oops, we screwed up, let's have a holiday, right? And then, if you got caught, you owe people money, then you go out of business and, the creditors can come in and get your assets the way any other business does that gets caught with its pants down is insolvent, that I think naturally the reserve ratio would be higher. And I also think there'd be different types of things offered, that, there'd be certain types of accounts that would be advertised as, oh, we have very high, or maybe even 100% reserves, and you got to pay us to be able to use your checking account and whatever, because how else are we supposed to make money? Because we're keeping it all in the vault, right? Yeah. So I just, again, with all this stuff, I'm not centrally planning. I want to allow competition. I think the reason in practice, I mean, people were asking, I was on a call today, we were saying how the stable coins were mandated 100%, and people, some of them didn't know what's the reserve ratio on banks. And I said, well, since COVID, it's zero, right? There's no legal reserve requirement on regular banks now at all. So I think that yes, at the very least, that type of system, if it really were an economic situation where for some reason the public wanted to hold base money or near substitutes, I think the system could accommodate that, and you certainly would not need to build a whole infrastructure of, we need the federal government to just print money in order to accommodate. Because I think in the long run, it's self-defeating. That part of the reason people rush to cash is because of economic uncertainty, and giving the government the ability to just print with no constraint, to me, fuels economic instability. So you're not even solving the problem in the long run.
Yeah. So basically, if we didn't have the central planners, then we wouldn't have fractional reserve banking to begin with.
Well, or at least I think the reserve ratios would be a lot higher, a lot closer. Would it be above 85%? I don't know.
Well, I agree with what Bob just said. I mean, if we were to freeze the base, or if we were to some kind of frozen base, whether it's the dollar or gold or Bitcoin, whatever it may be, but you allow the market to innovate. So maybe the market wants stable coins. Maybe they want 100% reserve, but maybe the market wants something more like a free banking system where fractional reserve does exist. I think what I'm hearing Bob say is, let the market determine that, and he'd be okay with that, and I would be too. If the world wants stable coin forms of money, 100% reserve, basically narrow banking, and that's what the market wants, so be it. If they want fractional reserve banking, I want to be open to that too.
Okay, but then David, what happens in a crisis situation? You default back to, well, the government needs to step in?
You would have to, and I, again, this is one reason I think we can't escape ultimately some form of a government authority that provides liquidity in crisis. So even if we consolidated the Fed and Treasury into one entity, as Bob was suggesting, because the dollar's footprint is so pervasive around the world, I suspect during a crisis, again, a pandemic hits, nobody, well, actually, I should guard what I was about to say. No one created that, in a mean way. So maybe I'll take those words back. I was about to say, but it was an outside shock to the global economy. How about that? That wasn't foreseen, and it was
we need a fact checker on that one.
Okay. It's so large, so severe, no one saw it coming. Yeah, I think you would still have to have the government, and somehow, again, given the scope of the dollar's reach. And I'll invoke a good Austrian here, Karl Menger. What's the most sellable asset? It's the dollar. It's around the world. It's everywhere. It's the ultimate network effect. It's the global hegemon. And I think this network effect is put us in a place where something like that, George, would be necessary in an extreme crisis.
What about that, Bob? Sure, there's trade-offs here. You're talking about some of the disadvantages of having a central bank, but maybe if it wasn't for the central bank, the dollar wouldn't be the world reserve currency, and the United States wouldn't have this exorbitant privilege. Now, you can say that we're misusing that privilege, but is it not beneficial that we at least have it at our disposal?
Okay, so there's two separate things there. I think that how did the U.S. dollar get to its position? And this is kind of right. If I take a step back in terms of like the MMT critique, and I know David and George, you're not probably huge fans of MMT also, but they point to monetary sovereigns, and I point out that historically the countries whose currencies have all these special privileges in the MMT framework, it's because they were tied to gold. In other words, they were very responsible, non-inflating types of bankers, central bankers, and that's how they got to their current position. So I think likewise, yes, historically, if the U.S. had stuck to the classical gold standard, I think, number one, because you could say, Well, no, it wasn't so much the dollar per se. It was U.S. Military might and economic strength, and that's why in the Bretton Woods era, the U.S. was the big boy in town. But those two, in my mind, go together, right? In other words, having a strong currency helps your economy, right? You're not doing your economy any favors by having a printing press running willy-nilly, right? That's not creating more real goods and services or technological know-how. And so I think partly what explains why was the U.S. the dominant economic power in 1947, it was partly because its legacy of having that fiscal and monetary prudence that David earlier alluded to, right? So there's that element, and then on the narrow question of has it helped the U.S. to be able to run massive trade deficits? One thing I'll say on that is just to make sure people understand, from 1946 to 1971, in terms of just the annual averages, I think there was only 1 year where the U.S. ran a trade deficit, right? So even in that period, that it was not, the interwar standard per se. It was really leaving the gold standard that allowed all those massive trade deficits to start much. And then from like 71 onward, I think there were only 2 years where the U.S. had a trade surplus. Okay, so I really, I think it's not so much even the interwar period, but again, it was severing the tide of gold that, in my mind, allowed them to print, allowed the federal government to run massive deficits, and that's what kind of fueled. If the federal government's borrowing money from abroad, mechanically they're sending us cars and other goodies, and that's kind of how they're lending to us in the present. We're just piling up future obligations. So, long way of answering your question, George, is I think that in the long run, no, that's actually not a good thing, that you're sort of giving the tequila to the 18-year-olds and saying, no, use this responsibly. And I just don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. So, David, sure, the Fed comes in during a crisis and does save the day. And if looking at just a snapshot in time, trade-offs make sense. But unfortunately, you still have the Fed after that, or the central planners, and they're going to continue to central plan. So you've got the good, but you got to take the bad as well. And on net balance overall, if you zoom out, then the Fed is a negative. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, over the long run, you could make that argument. I might make the argument, there was the great moderation period. It seemed to do a better job. There's this famous Taylor rule that says the Fed should respond to output gap to inflation. It seemed to do a decent job up until, I forget, early 2000s, mid 2000s following that. And yeah, it's deviated since then. But I think that it's possible. I mean, this is why it's important to have rules based. I'm sure Bob would say, cut to the chase, David. Make the ultimate rule. Make it tie both hands behind their back, not just one hand, David, with the monetary policy rule. But again, I just don't see us being able to get there. Bob's vision may be the right one. I don't know, but I don't think we'll ever be there. So I have to work in the world where we do have a central bank, aim for the best rule, aim for the best operating system. And, again, I will beat this drum, the rest of this podcast. I think the ability of the Fed to even have a good rule depends on keeping the fiscal house in order. It's always lurking in the background. The fact that the Fed was able to do a better job in the 80s and much of the 90s was because there had been some reforms in terms of taxes, and we started to see more primary deficits being run. Monetary policy, again, does not act solely alone. It has to have in the background fiscal policy, keeping the government solvent so that it can choose the path for policy. Now, I'm sure Bob and others would say, well, why 2% inflation? Why not 0%? Why not have some mild deflation, which is a fair question. But I don't think we have a choice, George, to answer your question in terms of just pulling the plug and going somewhere else.
And Bob, so maybe it's fiscal that causes the inflation. Maybe it wasn't leaving the gold standard. Maybe it wasn't the Fed's balance sheet. Maybe the real problem here is fiscal. And if you just target that and then just let the Fed be based on the practicalities of what we're dealing with, that's a better path forward.
So again, in terms of the pure economics of it, I don't disagree. I mean, certainly, at the very least, the two go hand in hand. But again, I don't think in practice they're independent. I mean, if you even just go read conventional histories of the formation of central banks and what function do they serve. I mean, a lot of times they'll say things along the, they'll use different language, but a financing agent of the government or so forth. And the king needed to fund his expenditures, and so that's why he gave special privileges to this bank and blah blah blah. Right. So this is not some wild conspiracy theory that I'm saying, that part of the function of a central bank is to monetize the spending of the sovereign. Right. That's why they like central banks. That's why they want to have them there. Okay. So I think there's that element. And then, again, even like we're saying with Trump and everything, I think the federal government would not have borrowed so many trillions and trillions of dollars since 2008 if they didn't think the Fed is waiting there to monetize this, and that we don't need to worry about, well, geez, what if the bondholders around the world all of a sudden get nervous and interest rates zoom up, and all of a sudden our annual interest expenditures rise by $500 billion because, well, no, the Fed's there and they can kind of step in if that were ever to happen, and give us some breathing room. So again, I don't think it's just an independent thing that the Treasury is going to do whatever it's going to do, irrespective of the existence of the Fed. That's just not the case. Let me just mention one other thing too quickly in response to what he said there. That yes, the different policies of the Fed, different strategies, and they can learn from their mistake, but this just keeps happening, right? Even conventional assessments of the Fed's performance, a lot of times they start in 1947. They just give the Great Depression like a mulligan, like, oh, well, they were, they didn't know what they were doing then, but let's, okay, now that we can go, okay, lesson learned. And then they thought they had it right in the early 2000s. I think it was like a birthday. David probably knows better than I do. I think it was a birthday party for Milton Friedman or something, or some celebration. And Ben Bernanke, he wasn't Fed chair at the time, but he said something like, let me slightly abuse my position to say on behalf of the Federal Reserve, you're right, Milton, we did it, meaning caused the Great Depression. But thanks to you, we won't do it again, or something like that, right? And, well, it did happen again, right? So there's this thing, they call it the Great Moderation, where some macroeconomists were very proud of themselves circa 2002 or whatever, that they had solved the major problems, and that, yeah, we had some bad stretches there, and our predecessors didn't know what they were doing. We've got it all figured out. And then, oh no, we don't. Okay, so again, with this stuff, I'm sure NGP targeting, all these things would work, and then there's going to be some other huge crisis, and they're going to say, oh, okay, well, let me adjust my models, and now we won't do that again. And I'm saying that's going to keep happening. Better to take away these wands and printing presses from these monetary wizards.
Bob, how did we get the big deficits and the big debt from, let's say, 1971 to 2007 if the Fed's balance sheet didn't move? And I'm talking specifically about bank reserves.
I don't have the figures in front of me, but I do think the Fed did partly monetize that.
Okay, so your opinion is that if we looked at the Fed's balance sheet, that the bank reserves would have gone up at least significantly to the point that allowed the government to do what it was doing during that time frame. And part of that's because we went off the gold standard.
Right. So for sure, I think leaving the gold standard, that's not a coincidence. We had the worst peacetime inflation in U.S. history, right after that and so forth. I know, George, you and I have, privately gone back and forth, and I was surprised that, bank reserves did not rise as much as I would have thought.
Yeah.
But I still do think that it's not a coincidence that that Nixon closing the gold window in 71.
Yeah.
And then you get the rampant consumer price inflation a few years later. I don't think that's a coincidence. And certainly by some measures, you can see that the monetary base, the rate of growth of that in the 70s, there were periods where it was high.
Yeah. And David, on Bob's point there, let's assume that the Fed's balance sheet didn't change during that time frame, but maybe it still facilitated the additional government spending, because although they never stepped in and bought that much, there was always that Fed put, if you will. So the government knows that it can go ahead and deficit spend, and it can increase the debts, which it did during the 1980s for sure under Reagan. The debt goes up, and from, I believe, what was it in 1980? I think it was about 800 billion or something like that. And then prior to the GFC, it was up at 7 trillion. So maybe the reason the Fed was spending all of that money was because of the implied backstop of the Fed.
That's a possibility. And without a doubt, the Fed influences financial conditions. It can influence the expected path of interest rates, as you know well, George. One theory of long-term treasury yields is the expected path of the Fed funds rate. And so I want to be very clear here. I've been stressing the importance of fiscal solvency, but without a doubt, the Fed can do a lot of damage to the economy because it does influence the financial system. I think it contributed for sure to the severity of the Great Depression. It contributed, I think, to the severity of the Great Recession. It can do damage on the financial through the financial system to the real economy. What I don't think it can do on its own, and really needs the help of the federal government and fiscal profligacy, is raising trend inflation. Trend inflation, higher and sustainable higher inflation, those are all tied to what's happening with the fiscal path of the government. So yeah, the Fed has a role to play in stability financially, but I think we're worried about inflation, inflation tax. That goes back to what the government is doing. And the Bretton Woods system, to me, is an interesting example of this. So Bob mentioned, we went off of that and things seem to have gone sideways since then. I mean, heck, Bob, we could throw in productivity growth if we wanted to, but I think it's more complicated than the Bretton Woods system. But I would say this about the Bretton Woods system. When Nixon took us off of it, I look at it as something like a divorce. By the time a couple gets to a divorce, there's been problems for some time already. Divorce just kind of seals the deal, right? It's a legal transaction. We're done. There were problems leading up to that. So going off the Bretton Woods system was simply a result of the years leading up to, in the 1960s, the guns and butter, Lyndon Johnson trying to fight the Vietnam War and fuel the Great Society with funding. And so going off of the Bretton Woods, to me, again, wasn't the Fed. It was fiscal profligacy, and we had to do that. So we had to do that given the choices we were making in terms of fiscal policy.
Okay,
so
Bob, real quickly, how's your phone doing on battery?
I think it's all right, but we probably shouldn't push it too much.
Okay, so just one more thing here that I'd like maybe both of you to touch on. We've discussed the mechanical components of what makes the Fed, but what about the psychological components? I mean, Bob, what's your opinion on how the Fed distorts the economy through psychology? And then maybe David, you can respond to that.
Sure.
But sure, and just two quick things on what David earlier said. I don't know if he was saying that facetiously, but in terms of, there's lots of economic indicators that turn around in the early 70s, and even some leftist groups like income inequality, standard measures, it looks like it's, quote, getting better, meaning like the ratio of the top 1%'s wealth to the bottom 99 is falling through the 50s and 60s. And then it just turns around in the early 70s, or the apparent disconnect between worker productivity and compensation. It seems like it tracks pretty well. And then there's just this divergence in the 70s, and a lot of free market right-winger types come in and try to explain the data away. And then a lot of leftists try to say, oh, that's Reagan tax cuts for you, when it's off by a decade. And I want to say, well, that's kind of funny that it all happens right around when Nixon went off gold, right? So anyway, I'll just mention that. And to say it's like a divorce, right, but it's like you give the husband the ability to print girlfriends. And okay, yeah, there's things that clean up in a divorce, right? Okay, so I could have said blowing up girlfriends like acid bubbles. That would have been a better joke. Okay, but seriously, as far as the psychology, and this might sound like I'm being flippant or glib, but I mean this sincerely. I think, do you remember when the bailouts hit, and they called it that too? That was, they called the bailouts in 2008. There were ads running for, like, companies saying to people, like, come down to, Raymond Furniture Center and get your own bailout. We'll give you a couple of this for 100, and it was just
like
whole
used cars,
and money stopped being real. It was all this, and then also too, and this is partly my fault. I was part of this. Is when the Fed's balance sheet went way up, a couple of us, or many of us, including me, were running around warning people, I think, this might cause serious consumer price inflation. And we were wrong on that narrow score. In fairness, our critics were wrong the other way in COVID, when they were all saying, oh, it's transitory, it's supply shock. And then, they just kept being wrong about how bad it was going to be. So I think there, it cancels out and we're all wrong. But my point being that I think because people just all of a sudden thought, oh, so it looks like the Fed can just create trillions of dollars and nothing bad happens. And I think that was a very bad thing psychologically, that it gave permission. I mean, the idea of $1 trillion, like George W. Bush, I think it was, I might be wrong, I think it was like $360 billion stimulus package in his first term or something. And that was just considered this budget busting, crazy, irresponsible right-wing Republican handout. And, again, it was like in the hundreds of billions. And now that's nothing, right? So I think all of that just contribute. And the public just doesn't believe money even means anything anymore. And so I do think that does feed into a deeper problem. And among other things, like business people can't make long-term projections. The idea of a 99-year bond now denominated in US dollars would be insane. But yet that type of thing, there used to be British consuls that people used to lend their money to the British government with no payback, just it was perpetual interest because it's tied to the pound's tied to silver or gold. So I do think that is very crippling, and it's bad for society as a whole beyond the narrow financial metrics we can point to.
Yeah. So David, wouldn't that be like the ultimate negative trade-off? The ultimate cost is that we create all this malinvestment and misallocation of resources, not necessarily because of the mechanical components of what the Fed's doing or their balance sheet, but more so the psychological components.
Without a doubt. I mean, I think one of the great insights from Austrian economics is malinvestment, and certainly expectations play a role in that. And I would highlight, in my mind, the biggest expectation challenge or maybe opportunity for those who saw it this way was we went through a decade of low inflation, low rates, no apparent cost running big deficits in the 2010s. And that opened the door for MMT in the early 2020s. It seemed like we could get away with this. And to be fair, there was also a pandemic. So I think, it would have cost a lot of money no matter what. But the fact that we went so big, say in 2021, Trump went big, and then Biden had his own package, which was, I think, 1.9 trillion, close to 2 trillion. And even people like Larry Summers were saying, this is nuts. The bathtub's going to overflow. But people were saying, Larry Summers, no idea what you're talking about. We've seen the past decade. So I do think that matters. Now, I'll put that on one side. On the other side, I do think expectations also play an important role in keeping the economy grounded in terms of inflation expectations. I do think it's important for the Fed to talk a game of, we care about inflation expectations. We want to keep them anchored. Even though I've been talking up fiscal policy a lot this show, the Fed cannot come out and say, oh gosh, we're getting close to fiscal dominance. They have to keep saying, hey, we're here to fight the good fight, to keep inflation anchored. So that's a very important role, is to at least get the markets to believe. And hopefully in the meantime, we can get Congress to get its act together to rein in the fiscal excesses. Of course, that's not happening. But yeah, look at Treasury break evens. Even now, they don't seem to be terribly worried about what's happening in DC, which is surprising, and has been surprising for a long time.
Yeah. So, but Bob, we want the good type of psychological manipulation, not the bad type. All right. So, guys, let's go ahead and do the closing arguments. Bob, why don't we go ahead and start with you? Because David, I think we kind of agree on a lot of things here. So, Bob, you can take the first stab at it, and then we can conclude with David so he can kind of articulate maybe why we should, because I think a lot of people watching this video as well are going to be on the side of end the Fed. So we'll kind of give the last word to David so he can try to convince us otherwise.
Okay, sure. Well, let me just give a plug to my book, Understanding Money Mechanics. If you Google Robert Murphy that, and you'll get the PDF of that. And I go over a lot of this stuff if you want to see more about the things I've alluded to here, just to see it spelled out in the sources and so forth. And also, I would recommend Murray Rothbard's book, The Panic of 1819. That was like his doctoral dissertation, where he goes through it. Because I think one asterisk of here, which we didn't address, is somebody could say to me, well, if the Fed's responsible for all this bad stuff, how come we had panics and crises before the Fed, right? And so Rothbard goes through, and you can see from an Austrian lens what happened there. And the punchline is going to be, it was partly the Bank of the United States at that point, giving privileges and allowing for inflation, and then that just kept the punch bowl going and so forth. So I would just point people to that. So let me I just say, obviously, this is a very friendly debate. David and I agree on a lot. And I understand, him saying, hey, it's unrealistic. Central banks are here to stay. Let me just reform it this way. To me, what's really unrealistic is to say we're going to keep the bank and then have it do things the way David recommends, right? So I agree. Yes, getting rid of the central bank would be a difficult challenge, but I think, that's something you could do. You could marshal public support for it. You could go ahead and do something radical. It would just take people focusing on that for a bit. And then once it was gone, it would be hard. You'd have to reestablish it, right? It wouldn't be there anymore. Whereas, they could do NGP targeting or whatever, but it would be easy to stray from that. I mean, there was a big thing where they had average inflation targeting. And a bunch of guys like Scott Sumner and all them were like, hey, that's better than nothing. And then, wait a minute, they said they're not even doing it. What the heck, right? So I'm just saying that sort of thing happens all the time. Because again, we're having the academic debate, and I love doing that. I'm a nerdy guy too. But let's just be practical. These are some of the most powerful people on planet Earth that have access to printing presses, right? Would you trust the guy down the street with a printing press? No. And so just to give it to a bunch of bankers, that's not a good idea, right? That's going to lead to disaster. And again, historically, you can see how it's been used to finance wars. That's one of the justifications for it, is to say, well, what if we had to fight a war? We can't be tied to digging up more gold, right? And so I'm saying, to me, it's pretty clear that other things equal, making it harder for your government to take your people into war is actually a good thing. It's not a negative. The Fed's own record, standard analysis shows they've destroyed the purchasing power of the dollar. There's been more economic instability post creation of the Fed than before. They keep saying, okay, now for real, going forward, we got it. And oops, all right, we didn't see that coming, but trust us, now we got. And they just keep being wrong, and they keep being the Great Depression, the Great Recession. There'll be the great something else, I'm sure, in a few years, and then they'll explain why they got it under control at that point. So for all these reasons, I would say let's get rid of the central bank. You can still have the U.S. dollar, and just the Treasury can take that. And at least, last thing I'll say is, yes, they could abuse that as well, but I think there would be more accountability. At least then the public would be able to know who's doing it, and they could vote those people out. Whereas right now, it's this shadowy organization that part of its appeal is, oh, we're independent. Right, we're independent of politics, and yet they can bail out people and then not even tell the government, and they enjoy these political privileges. So for all these reasons, and the Fed.
All right. So David, practically speaking, in central bank terms, you can't be half pregnant. What's your response to that?
Well, Bob just shared a number of good reasons why, my ambitions for reforming the Fed may not matter. And we need to go cold turkey, go all the way in, which is fair enough. So you've heard my points. Let me just say two things. One, I think whether we want to get the reforms that I want or the more radical reforms that Bob wants, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So even my modest reforms probably will be put on hold because of fiscal dominance. What I do think is going to happen is we're going to have an inflation crisis in this country soon. We saw what happened in 21 and 22, 23. The electorate does not like that. And I think that's going to bring some of the reforms that we've talked about today. But until then, you need people like Bob and people like me. And we play two different roles. Now, Bob, as I mentioned earlier, referred to me as Count Dooku from Star Wars. I'm going to go biblical here and do a different analogy. Bob and I are both devoted Christians. I view Bob as the prophet Isaiah. He's railing against Babylon. Babylon is the Fed. He's warning it's not sustainable. It's going to come down. Don't get complacent. Don't take it seriously. I'm more like Daniel inside Babylon. I'm trying to make it more run effective, more efficient. And to be clear, I'm the assistant to Daniel. I'm not Daniel. I'm the Dwight Schrute of Babylon, trying to make it work better. And you need both voices. I think you need both people in the system. I work in DC. I go to conferences with Fed officials. I do podcasts. I write policy briefs, trying to reach them, make differences on the margin. You need people like Bob on the outside fighting the good fight as well. So I think in some sense, Bob and I make a great team. We're doing the Lord's work to complete the Bible, the biblical analogy here.
All right, guys. Well, thank you both for a wonderful debate. It's always fun. And like we said before we started recording or before we went live, what this is all about is just getting people to think. And I believe you guys did a great job of that. So on that bombshell, I'd like to thank the viewers and thank JM Bullion, the official sponsor here. Go check out their website. You can get their gold from the ZeroHedge official sponsor. And thanks for joining us on this discussion. We'll see you on the next one.